Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're calling from today. Really thrilled to have you here for another great DB Labs conversation, webinar on one of my favorite topics, DevOps metrics and measurement in action. We're really thrilled to be joined today by Dr. Nicole Forsgren for our webinar, Measuring Performance, the Science of DevOps Measurement in Action. My name is Tim Buntel. I'm part of the product team here at DB Labs. I've been fortunate to join our guest today in a couple of previous webinars, and I'm going to mostly just sit back because Nicole has such amazing information to share and always brings up great points. So I'm largely going to just sit back, and I'll come back towards the end for the Q&A. But for now, I'm just really thrilled and delighted to once again welcome Dr. Nicole Forsgren from DORA and a number of other initiatives to join us to talk about this great subject. So hi, Nicole, welcome, and take it away.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me, and I'll make a quick apology. I'm trying to save my voice this morning, so sorry if it cracks a little bit. But as Tim mentioned, I'm Nicole Forsgren. I am CEO and co-founder, Chief Scientist at DORA, DevOps Research and Assessment. For those of you not familiar with DORA, DORA is myself, Jez Humble, Jean Kim. We're the core co-founders, also joined by Sue Choi. And the core team is also the group behind the State of DevOps reports, who the last few years we've partnered with Puppet on. So where I've kind of gathered so much of my data and so much of my insights is around a lot of this data. Much of my research also goes back about a decade now, believe it or not, Tim. So much of my dissertation research actually kind of started looking at how we can understand excellence in software development and delivery, and what it means when we really start looking at technologies and automation and how we can really drive effectiveness and excellence. And so what we will be looking at today is measuring performance, some common mistakes. We'll also look at our approach. And when I say our approach, this is kind of the approach that we've adopted over the last 4 years now on the State of DevOps report. So this is over 23,000 data points around the world, all industries. And we found some really strong predictive results to help us really drive software delivery performance. And here we can take a quick look so you can see where you are. At this point, I'll take a nice quick step into maturity models, and we'll discuss these. Then we'll kind of also take another step into the software delivery performance even matter. You may have dialed in to try to figure out if technology matters, or you may be here to help understand how to communicate how technology matters. So we'll talk about that. Then we'll discuss quickly how to improve your own performance. And then we'll wrap up on how you can help. So let's start with some common mistakes. So let's go ahead and just say, let's just own this. Measuring software is difficult, right? This is actually a relatively young field when we think about it, right? When we look at things like engineering, like civil engineering, or when we look at things like manufacturing, those disciplines have been around for a very, very long time, or even accounting, right? That's been around for a long time. So it should come as no surprise that measurement and metrics and outcomes-based measurement has kind of been figured out relatively well. So when we move over into software, it's relatively new. So we're really kind of still figuring this out. It's okay that we don't have one, or at least it's understandable that we don't have one common standard. So these are the biggest mistakes that we often see. The first is a focus on outputs versus outcomes, right? So what we want is outcomes. Okay, this is the goal. We really should be focusing on outcomes, not just outputs. The second biggest mistake that we often see is a focus on individual or local measures versus team and global measures. We're seeing over and over and over again that team measures of performance, global measures of performance really are far superior. And so to kind of illustrate this, I'll walk through 3 common examples: lines of code, velocity, and utilization. These are things that have commonly been used to try to capture and measure software performance. So if we start with lines of code, some people may think that more is better, right? And I'm sure so many people here have seen or are familiar with the idea that we want to measure output in terms of lines of code. But if we just say more is better, we end up getting bloated software. This gives us higher maintenance costs. This gives us more technical debt, and it ends up creating a higher cost of change. If we ever want to augment or change or update our software later, we have a much larger code base to deal with, which makes it really, really difficult. It makes onboarding our new employees more difficult, makes maintaining the code base more difficult. It's really difficult and problematic. Okay, so then the opposite. What about less is better? Some of you may be familiar with, some universities or some areas will have competitions about who can get the most done in the least amount of code. This is also challenging, because what happens if you end up with super, super, super concise code that absolutely no one can read, right? It gets something done, but no one understands any of it. So what really is ideal is solving business problems with the most efficient amount of code, right? And that's not something that we can easily measure. One reason people like lines of code is because it's easy to measure. However, that doesn't mean it's the right thing to be measuring. Now, moving on, velocity. Now, this comes from the Agile canon, right? So in Agile, problems are broken down into stories, for those of you not aware or not familiar with this. Problems are broken down into stories. Stories are assigned points, and these points are estimated efforts to complete. But I'll point out, these estimated effort points are for that particular team, okay? Now, at the end of a sprint, total points signed off by the customer is the velocity. Now, let's point out here, velocity is a capacity planning tool. It helps you think about and estimate how much work can be done for that team. It should not be used as a productivity tool. Now here's why. Velocity is a relative measure. It's not absolute. Remember I said above that these points are assigned for that team? That's what I mean. It's bad for comparing teams. The second is that oftentimes you may just inflate your estimates, right, to make sure that you can kind of game your measures. The most problematic one that I see really, though, is this last one. What happens is if teams know that their productivity is being measured by points, they'll focus on their own work and they will not help anyone else, because think about it this way. Anytime you help someone else, if you take time to help someone else, you aren't finishing your own points. Remember, that's an example of a local measure versus a global measure. If the goal is to deliver code, to deliver value for our customers, that's a global goal. That's a global measure. We should all be working towards these outcomes. But if I will be punished for not completing my own story points, then I won't be incented to do that at all. Oh, sorry. Now on to utilization. Now, utilization is only good up into a point. Now, utilization is how much time we're using of a resource. Here, our default might be that higher utilization is better, but high utilization doesn't provide us any type of slack for unplanned work. And we all know that we get this unplanned work, right? Now, in math, Q theory tells us that as utilization approaches 100%, lead times approach infinity. So in practice, what we see is that once we hit higher and higher levels of utilization, basically the busier and the busier that we get, teams take longer and longer to get work done, which is a problem, right? Because our goal is to get work through the system as fast as we can. So the approach that we have used in measuring software delivery performance has focused on both outcomes and global measures. So our outcome is developing and delivering software with both speed and stability at an overall level. So if anyone has ever heard me speak before, some of these measures will probably be very familiar, or if you've ever seen the State of DevOps reports, these will be familiar. So you'll notice I said developing and delivering software with speed and stability. This speaks to the DevOps teams, right? Development and operations. So developing and delivering software with speed and stability. So these are both outcomes and global measures. So let's look at the speed portion, okay? So this is deploy frequency, how often we can deploy this code to production or into kind of a pre-prod state if we're working with packaged software, or we have kind of a release cadence to our customers, something like, when we push to the Apple Store, right? Maybe we only push updates once a month. The key here is that we can release anytime the business demands. This ends up being a business decision and not a technical constraint. The second one is lead time for changes. Now, the way we measure this is code commit to code deploy. We focus on this portion of the software delivery pipeline because it is the most predictable. This is the most highly automated portion of the pipeline. If we go upstream from this, this is also very valuable work. However, if we think about it, this is where creative work happens, right? We expect and we understand higher variability here. So for this portion, we just go from code commit to code deploy. Now, for our stability measures, we have MTTR. And notice this is MTTR, not MTBF, not mean time between failures, but mean time to recover. And here's why. We expect failures to happen. We know failures will happen. So the goal is to recover as quickly as possible. And it's not just mean time between failures, because what if we only have a failure once a year, but it is epic, and it is huge, and it is large, and let's say we're in retail and it happens on Black Friday. It will not matter that our MTBF is 1 year. What matters is that we can recover very, very quickly. Okay, and then the last one is change fail rate. What is the likelihood that our changes will result in any type of service incident? It doesn't necessarily need to take everything down. Do we need to address it? Now, one note here. We see more throughput, we see more stability, and we see these in tandem. Over the last 4 years of research, we see that the high performers are able to achieve throughput and stability without trade-offs that some suggest are necessary. I'll also note that our low performers are kind of sucking at all of it. And then our medium performers are kind of hanging out in the middle. We really aren't seeing trade-offs. So what does this look like? I just mentioned our high performers. So our high performers, if I compare them to our low performers, they're more agile. We see 46 times more frequent code deployments. This is the difference between multiple times a day and once a week or less. We also see faster lead time from commit to deploy. It's the difference between less than an hour and more than a week. So take a minute and think about this for your own context, right? What could you do if you were able to deliver code more quickly? You can delight your customers. We can pivot when we need to pivot. We can keep up with compliance and regulatory changes, right? We can deploy these changes quickly and easily when we need to in our systems. So let's also look at reliability, right? These stability measures. High performers have 96 times faster MTTR. So they're recovering in less than an hour instead of several days. And several days just makes me cringe a little bit, right? Now, they're also only 1/5 as likely that changes will fail. Now here I'm reporting a median, right, an average of some numbers. So high performer changes fail between 0 and 15% of the time. If I look back at the data historically, it really actually tends to fall in the 2, 3, 4% mark. When I look at the low performers are between 31 and 45% of the time. So now take a look at this chart, see where you might fall. And also notice our high performers are maximizing on all metrics. And again, these are our outcome measures, right? Because our goal in any type of DevOps work and DevOps transformation is our ability to develop and deliver software with both speed and stability. Now, at this point, I often get a question about maturity and DevOps maturity. And how do I feel about maturity models, or maybe readiness? Well, this is how I feel about maturity models. Maturity models don't work. It's not just the maturity models don't work. I'll just go ahead and lay this down. Maturity models are for chumps. Okay, this is, if anyone here has ever played World of Warcraft, or, okay, fine, if anyone here has heard of World of Warcraft, this was the land, right? This was the map for World of Warcraft when it first came out. You could only get to level 60. And if you got to level 60, like, you were amazing. That was as high as you were going to get. It was hard to get there, right? This was a serious goal. So let's create a maturity model for World of Warcraft, right? So let's say that, like, to be like, let's say 40 is moderate and you've landed on like one of the lands, and 50 is super high and you have to have conquered like all of one of those continents or something, and 60 is epic and you have to have conquered all of the lands, okay? And you've achieved this and you're amazing and like you can high five yourself and all your buddies, right? Okay, let's do this. Well, fast forward a few years and the world changed. World of Warcraft changed, right? You'll notice the landscape has changed. By the way, also, their tooling has changed. You can level up in different, not just level up differently, right? Now, you can get to level 110. So you can level up higher. They also have different tooling, different technologies, and the landscape itself has changed. By the way, technology is the same way. The competitive business environment is the same way. So if you had adopted and stuck to and set all of your organizational goals according to that dope maturity model that we had just created for level 60, you are now in the dust. You're no longer good enough. And you're not only no longer good enough, you were like really, really bad, right? You're missing 3 entire lands, you're missing animals, you're missing technologies, you're missing tooling. So if you sit and look at a maturity model, the rest of the competition continues to get better while you don't, right? The concern is that if we don't continue to get better, like the best, most innovative organizations do, we will have a resource problem, right? We won't continue to dedicate resources, where resources, sure, could be money, but it could be time, it could be attention. And I think that's the biggest danger, is that we ourselves, but also our leadership and our executives, won't devote attention to understanding where we really need to go. And by the way, we see this year over year. What is good enough in one year is out of date the next. So keep that in mind as we continually improve. So, does software delivery performance matter though, right? I said we want to focus on outcomes and global measures. And I said technology was important. The ability to develop and deliver software with speed and security. I've said that, but wait a minute. Nicholas Carr wrote a paper in 2003 in HBR, and the title was IT Doesn't Matter. that was frustrating because everyone reads Harvard Business Review, right? Everyone reads HBR. Well, it's interesting because at the time, Nicholas Carr had a really good point, right? This was based on data that came out of the 80s and the 90s when the way we did technology was to just buy it and install it and then walk away. So it was not for competitive advantage. It wasn't a strategic advantage for us. It was just like buying a laptop, right? Although it was often complicated laptops, right? It was really big servers or maybe really big ERP systems. But when everyone else can buy the exact same server and the exact same ERP system, it doesn't get us anything. Well, building software that helps us get ahead for competitive advantage that we can leverage, now that's different. So our research has found that this is different, but it's not just us. Besson out of Boston University has found this. Brynjolfsson out of MIT has also found this just in the last few years. So IT is driving this change. And again, remember, it's speed, it's stability, and we can have both. So DevOps is good for organizations. The ability to develop and deliver software with speed and stability, because it lets us deliver value to our customers, pivot when we need to pivot, keep up with compliance and regulatory changes. And this is what we found. High-performing organizations are twice as likely to achieve or exceed commercial goals. Things like productivity, profitability, market share, number of customers. Now, we found this for 4 years in a row. But we did have some people come to us and say, what if I work in a not-for-profit space? Or what if more is important to me than just money? And so we extended our research to investigate non-commercial goals, and we found the same was true. High-performing technology organizations are twice as likely to achieve or exceed non-commercial goals as well. Quantity of products and services, operating efficiency, customer satisfaction, quality of products or services, and achieving organization and mission goals. Now, for a little bonus, in 2014, we were able to capture a large enough data set that included publicly traded companies. And we found that the high-performing organizations had a 50% higher market cap growth over the previous 3 years. So we really do see that the ability to leverage technology is really driving organizational growth. Okay. So how to improve and how you can accelerate your own journey. You can do this by using an outcomes-based, capability-focused approach. So what does that mean? Basically, we've been talking so far about how software development and delivery drives organizational outcomes, right? You want to be a high performer. But how can you become a high performer? Our research has uncovered core capabilities that really drive high performance in predictive ways. These fall into 4 categories: technology and automation, process, measurement and monitoring, and then culture. So, technology and automation. Here's a quick list. Use of version control. By the way, this is use of version control for all production artifacts. It's not just your application code. It's your application configuration, it's your system configuration, deployment automation, continuous integration, trunk-based development, having a good, strong, automated test suite where developers contribute, test data management, shifting left on security. By the way, that means like including your InfoSec team early in the process and throughout the process. Having strong continuous delivery practices, having a good loosely coupled architecture, and architecting for empowered teams. Now, under process, we're looking at gathering and implementing customer feedback and making that visible to your technical teams. Working in small batches, because that enables single piece fast flow through your pipeline. Having a lightweight change approval process. Maybe just getting rid of your cab, or at least not having them approve changes. They're great for notification. They're not great for approving changes. And then letting teams experiment. Now, within measurement and monitoring, having visual management, monitoring, and then using that monitoring outcome to make business decisions, checking your system health proactively, using WIP limits, and then having visualizations. Now, within culture, using a Western organizational culture, this is a culture that really highlights and optimizes for information flow, trust, smart risk-taking, having a climate for learning, optimizing for collaboration among teams. I'm sure we've all heard breaking down silos, making work meaningful, and then transformational leadership. Now, so often people come ask me, where should I start? Honestly, the answer is it depends. Every team is different. Every organization is different. I'm sure you've seen this. Now, that said, these are the patterns that I see most often in my work. Now, in the 2017 State of DevOps report, architecture was the highest contributor to continuous delivery. And it shows up in a lot of the teams that we work with at DORA. Now, within DORA, we see it show up a few different places. One is the need for a loosely coupled architecture, right? So you can see this through a service-oriented architecture, through stronger APIs, or we can also see this sometimes through trunk-based development. These are quite often constraints for teams. So maybe step back, take a look, see how your technology is architected. Now, I do want to mention here, this does not mean you have to be greenfield development. We see this work very often and be very true in mainframe and legacy environments. It might be a little bit trickier to re-architect these technologies, but it can be done. Now, the next one. Having a lightweight change approval process is a constraint for so many teams that we work with at DORA. So what does that mean? What that means is so often having to get every change approved by a governing body or a board or a change approval board or whatever you want to call it ends up introducing so much delay and oftentimes so much error. So if you can find ways to streamline this process, think about it. Maybe adopt a risk-based approach. The DevOps handbook outlines this really well, and we touch on it as well in Accelerate. Now, continuous integration is also a really strong component of technical work, and it's really interesting because so many teams that we work with all say, oh, we do CI, because so many companies have a goal of doing CI. But continuous integration has a few key steps. They include making sure that when you check in code, it automatically triggers a build of the software. When you check in code, it automatically triggers automated tests, right? Think about what continuous integration means. Make sure you're doing all of it. And then make sure you're doing it in fluency. So what that means is when everything is stressful and everything's crazy and everything's on fire, does it all still happen? Now, so then what should you do? The first is identify your constraints. Think about the things that might be holding you back the most and pick a few. I get worried when I work with organizations and they've got 50 initiatives. Death by initiative is real. Pick a few. Work to eliminate those constraints and then reevaluate your environment and your system. We work in complex systems, and so when you've eliminated one constraint, the entire system may reshuffle. You may have something that's a new constraint that wasn't even on your radar before. And then, of course, rinse and repeat. So, now, additional resources. So much of what I've outlined here is just a single chapter in Accelerate. So this summarizes the last 4 years of research in the State of DevOps report, plus tips on measurement, how to measure in your own organization. Another resource that I really love is Data Driven. It's a short book by DJ Patel and Hilary Mason. It's a free download. It's about 20 pages. And it helps you think about how to talk about measurement in your own organization. I recommend it almost everywhere I go. Now, you can help. What's your own role in this? One is you can be a transformational leader. I touched on transformational leaders before. We found that transformational leadership really underpins and drives so much in DevOps transformations and technology transformations. And you don't have to be a manager. You don't have to have direct reports to really drive transformation and to drive measurement and excellence in your organization. The next step is you can start by measuring a few things. Focus on outcomes. It may be software delivery performance, speed, and stability. If you're an IC, if you're an individual contributor, it might be software quality, bugs. It might be something like that. And then if that's your outcome, think about what you can do to improve that outcome. Drive performance through capability improvements, and try to think about something that is both technical and not technical. Maybe it's process-based. Maybe it's cultural-based. And then, of course, share your stories. Leverage the community. Reach out to your meetups. See what else is happening. For more information, our research is available. We have ROA white papers. We have case studies. The State of DevOps reports and peer-reviewed research is available at devops-research.com. Now, I know we had so many questions left. Well, previously submitted, and I know submitted now, so I wanted to make sure that we left some time for questions.
That's great, Nicole. Thank you so much. We do indeed have tons of questions, and I know your voice is a little scratchy, so we'll try to lob a few at you for the next 10 plus minutes. You know, I do want to. One thing, I'm so glad that you ended on this point about how can you get involved and sort of pick up the mantle of this mission within an organization. I will encourage folks to check out 2 webinars that we did previously that were based on some papers that were published at the DevOps Enterprise Forum last year, which was about sort of how do you scale DevOps, right? So how can you be, you mentioned being the champion there.
Yes, and you know what, that is a fantastic white paper. That's a really, really great one.
Yeah, and we had a great webinar with Gene and another guest and myself where we explored that one. And then the other one I wanted to point out to folks that you can, again, find on our recordings, webinar recordings page, was another DevOps Enterprise Forum paper on how do you win over individual holdouts, right? So as you're doing this, if you're coming up against roadblocks of folks who are resisting the change, how can you use some sort of proven principles to win them over and get them on your team? Because really this transformation is going to be successful only when you have the full commitment of everyone involved. So I think those 2 tie in nicely with this content that you shared here today.
Yeah, that's great.
Good. So let me dig into the questions, and I won't go in any specific order or with any specific point that you made, but just ones that seemed interesting and common. So I've got a bunch here that had to do with quality measures. So
yes.
Clearly lots of folks are interested in that. So how do you measure quality, and what is quality? And with these short cycles between releases, folks express difficulty sometimes finding ways to measure this in a way that takes customers into account and not other flaws. So could you talk just a little bit about quality for a few minutes?
Sure. So quality is actually one of the most difficult things to measure from an overall research program point of view. And I say that not as a cop-out, but maybe as a cop-out. And I say that because quality is an objective measure to a person, right? And we have a quote somewhere in the book, and I'm trying to remember who it is off the top of my head. But basically, if we think about it, quality is very, very context specific, right? So for organizations that make like web end user software, quality could be customer satisfaction, right? It could be measured by customer satisfaction metrics. It could be measured by, or if you're working on a retail site, quality could be proxied by number of orders or return visits or speed or frequency of return visits, right? But for other areas, right? Like let's think about the IRS's website, right? The tax website, filing taxes. Quality and customer satisfaction there is likely not going to be proxied by how often people revisit that website, because we only file taxes once a year and we probably don't have that many questions. And if we do have lots and lots and lots of questions, it's probably like revisiting that site is probably not a measure of satisfaction. It's probably a measure of poor information design, right? So that said, what we have used a few times are things like unplanned work, where lower unplanned work is a higher measure of quality. Sometimes we do use measures of customer satisfaction. You can use things like Net Promoter Score and Employee Net Promoter Score, so internal to the company, where Net Promoter Score, NPS, are things like how likely are you to recommend this company, product, or service to someone outside on a scale from like 0 to 10. NPS is nice because it ends up being used so much throughout the industry. You can kind of compare it across. But otherwise, and I've chatted with so many people throughout the industry and throughout academia about quality metrics. So if you're in the services industry, ServQual is known as a quality metric that ends up being very, very good. But, basically the answer is it depends, right? You'll really need to dig into what is most important for your organization and your team and what drives your core outcomes.
So kind of on that line, there's an interesting question here that I think you're speaking to a bit there, which the way this question was submitted was, should the measures be driven top down, sort of from business outcome backwards, or bottom up, where the teams choose what they feel is relevant? And I think there's probably two phases of this, right? So there's kind of the measures and the objectives. So yeah, take it away. So what do you think on that one?
Okay, so I'm going to say top down and. So I'm going to say a little bit of both. So, I'm sorry, excuse me. We should definitely be outcomes focused, right? Like we want to make sure that we are driving the outcomes that are the outcomes focused and global, right? We want to make sure that we are delivering value to our end users, whomever our end users are, right? Whether we're in government not-for-profit space and we are delivering information to our end users as efficiently as possible, or we are, working on a web retail commerce startup and we're like delivering, our superior customer experience so they can buy whatever widgets they want to buy. Now, that said, we can then say software development delivery is super important. Then we need to do, pick your capability that helps drive that. As we can chain these measures and these outcomes down throughout the organization. So I think our overall outcomes and metrics should be driven at the top strategic level of the organization, right? But as we start to drive down and drill down into the details of like, how do we at our organization make continuous integration better, right? How do we improve our version control practices? How do we fix our build times? How do we improve our release engineering? the executive shouldn't be driving that. Who should be doing that is someone saying, okay, our remit right now is to make CI amazing and better because it looks like that is what is slowing us down. Let's reach out to our experts, and our experts are our practitioners and our ICs and our team. Let's let them help us understand how to do this best and help us pick metrics to help us drive this. So at that level, your goal and your outcome is improving the CI process, knowing that that's part of a longer chain where CI is driving software development and delivery, and software development and delivery is driving organizational goals, right?
So let me add one more wrinkle to that then based on another question. So in addition to kind of business driven versus bottoms up, how about if you bring the actual maturity of the DevOps transformation into it? So this particular
the maturity
customer
word.
Yeah, so this customer said, are there
though.
ways to measure value in the sort of early, mid, and more mature stages of a journey? And so I can see this matrix starting to form, right, where you've got business-driven versus team-driven, and then early stage versus late stage. So what are your thoughts on that maturity level?
So I think what's most important is, so I'm going to break, I think there were two questions there, right? One was the maturity level, and the second was team-driven versus organization-driven, right? I think team-driven goals and team-driven outcomes and team-driven metrics always need to be in service of organizational goals, right? So in the example I just gave, when a team is trying to improve CI and CI practices, it is in service of the larger goal of developing and delivering software so that you can deliver product to customers faster and meet your revenue and customer sat goals, right? It is always in service of an organizational goal, but you leave the details to the experts on the ground because like they're the ones that really know what's happening. Now, when we talk about maturity, I kind of, had my lovely takedown on maturity models. I will say maturity models in terms of a DevOps transformation are tough, right? Because you shouldn't walk in and say, like one reason a maturity model isn't great for a DevOps transformation is because a technology transformation is lots of things, right? I just talked about some of them. It's technology, it's process, it's culture, it's metrics, it's so many things. And we assume that a maturity model assumes that these all move in lockstep for everyone, right? Like level 1 is like everything sucks, and level 2 is all of the other, like one step up on all of the things. But we know that teams don't look like that, right? We know some teams that are amazing at technology and bad at process and okay at culture, and other teams that are like amazing at culture and like awful at all the other things. So it's not a linear lockstep process in terms of a full transformation. Now, I will say that maturity in terms of technology or tool adoption, if you take one tiny piece, assessing or understanding maturity from one particular tooling can make sense, right? Like we need to have like an install base done before we can think about doing like mass customization for a particular tool, right? Like those things do make sense because those do tend to be a little more linear and a little more progressive for particular tooling or even some particular processes, right?
Yeah, it's kind of interesting point there about the durability of some of these metrics, right? So some things may become obsolete, I would imagine, over time.
Sure. And that's the best way to approach it is from an iterative standpoint, right? Pick up a metric that makes sense, iterate on it, improve, do the thing. And then once you realize, you know what, we're really doing really well on this. Maybe I don't need to pay attention to this metric anymore. If I've got it automated and I still throw it in the database, that's fine, but maybe don't throw it on my reports anymore. Because now we want to focus on something else.
Right, yeah, exactly. I'm actually looking in the questions submitted here, and someone asked that very question, right? I'll add, metrics are something that may be revisited, but how about the methodology? Do you suggest that organizations may need to tune that over time as well, so that you kind of don't get stale or obsolete in how you go about thinking about how to gather that information?
Oh, sure. I mean, because what works today may not work in the future, depending on how your own techniques and tooling and processes change.
Yep, that's great. Here, I've got one here that I know is one of your one of your favorites.
Oh, goody.
But someone brings up performance data. So how do you define DevOps maturity level using performance data? And I know there's some issues just with those two phrases. But what are your thoughts on performance data and its role to play here?
Yeah, so I mean, performance data can be a lot of things, right? I think the most important thing is we make sure that when we're talking about performance, we're thinking about again, outcomes, right? Like we don't use it as a stick to beat somebody else with, right? We don't compare teams to each other, right? That's never a good idea. And lots of the research shows that. There was a great paper in HBR, I think maybe with Deloitte teams showing that. So yeah, I'll probably keep that one a little short and just say,
Well, so
sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, go ahead.
Yeah, there are different versions of what people mean when they talk about performance. And so, like I said, team level, not individual level, and focus on those global level outcomes is usually the best bet.
So I know we're getting tight on time here, but just a couple more. And this one's kind of interesting because it's touching on what you were just saying. You're not comparing teams, but do you think that there's a way that measuring DevOps performance or measuring software value creation performance is how I'll rephrase it? Do you think that can help you find problems in how your organization itself is composed? Are there things that we can find in those metrics that can maybe give us some guidance on actual changes in the teams or changes in the organization?
Oh, like organization design?
Yeah, exactly. I think that's what this, this listener was suggesting. Yeah.
So that's interesting. So here's the thing. I mean, it depends. The answer is always it depends. Excuse me. So like as an example, I know ING, we have a fantastic case, contributed chapter written by Steve Bell and Karen Whitley Bell. It's amazing, and it comes out of ING, right? And they did this huge transformation, and they've accomplished these amazing things, and they achieved fantastic performance, right? I will even use that. And they are careful to point out that they were able to achieve all of that without making a single change to an org chart. 0 changes. So, like, that's one end of the spectrum. The other end of the spectrum says, you know what, sometimes you have to shake things up. Now, will that show up in your metrics? Sometimes, right? It depends on which metrics you're capturing. It depends on what you're looking for. You don't necessarily need an org chart change, although sometimes changing the org chart will help you disrupt some like dysfunctional behavior and anti-patterns. One thing that can be helpful though is, so we've done a few assessments with organizations where we've seen like an organizational culture metric measure really quite well, right? So they're really particularly strong at like the Westrom culture measure. They're doing pretty great at that, and things like making work meaningful. It's a particular measure of job satisfaction. And yet, for some reason, that's not driving outcomes, right? We have an algorithm that kind of ranks things and sorts them. And it's rare for me to ever see those two measures in particular rank high and not drive outcomes, because for years in the research, they've always driven high outcomes. And for years in research outside of technology, they've always been one of the strongest predictors of outcomes. And so then I can go to companies and I can say, this is interesting. Explain to me why this may be the case. What do you think is happening here? And so that can sometimes be an indication that if not, the solution to that might not be a reorg. The solution to that might be something else, like understanding what other things may be underpinning culture. Or in one case, what happened was they had just done a reorg. And that's how it was manifesting itself, was that the culture was amazing, but they were still kind of in that storming phase, right? They were still getting to know each other. And so those are some ways where it will like manifest itself in some of your metrics.
Yeah, and I would suggest, we've seen some folks look to some of these metrics to suggest things that will impact their organization, but not necessarily from a reorganization, right? So maybe it suggests the training, or maybe it suggests a need to get teams working together. Maybe you look at that and you decide you need to have an offsite from time to time, or there's things that are organizational that aren't necessarily org chart. Right?
Yes, exactly. Right. So often we sometimes jump to something like that because we're looking for quick, easy fixes. And I don't blame people for this, right? I mean, this is hard, right? If I could like quick fix anything, I super would. I completely, totally would. But sometimes it's just a little hard. But yeah, something like training and offsite, instituting stand-up, right? Like I had some companies that were like, oh, we need to do stand-up. And they're like, we do stand-up. And they're like, no, it's just on our calendar. We don't actually do it.
Yeah,
right? And then you just help implement good and consistent communication patterns.
Great. And let's just take one last one here, because I know we're gone a little past the time. I'm going to put two spins on this. So the question was, how do you show technical gain to business people? Okay, and I think there's certainly some things there about that we've already covered by basically focusing on the outcome. Yeah, but how about the visibility of this? So what are your thoughts on what are the best ways to make this visible in an organization?
Yes.
On the dev team, we have our our big monitor running in the team area where we see our CI build failure information. But how can we make some of this visible to other folks in the organization as well?
Yeah, I mean, dashboards and metrics are always fantastic. But in terms of like showing it to business people and communicating that to the business, I always sort of suggest following a 3-step process, right? So the first one, like kind of the first little panel I always take is like take your business metrics exactly as they are and like summarize. Excuse me. So it's like we went from, or we were able to achieve 20 releases a day or 20 releases a month, right? Or we went from 1 release a year to 4 releases a year, right? And people are going to be like, cool story. I have no idea what that means. But you're like, no, wait for it, right? This is what we were able to do, right? This is what we've done. And then in the next step, say, this is what that included, okay? So those now 4 releases included this feature to customers. It included this critical patch to infrastructure. It included this, like these 2 or 3 things, right? This major release. So talk about all those things, right? Outline those things. That's step 2. And then in step 3, so no, step 1, like tech metrics that like no one's going to debate. Step 2, things that they still probably won't debate. They might come back and say, oh, well, we were going to release that anyway. But then you could probably go back and say, no, like compared to the year before, like we were struggled super hard and we got like a third of that done. This year we struggled a little bit, but not really, and we got like way more done. And then in the third panel, you can work with someone in the business and say, okay, for the features we released, how much revenue did that generate in the year? And how much revenue do we project it will generate in the next year, 2 years, 3 years? Okay, for the critical patch that we were able to roll out, right? For the security patches, for the critical infrastructure that we did, what is our risk? What's our estimate of risk reduction? Help me turn that into a dollar amount, right? And then you can kind of roll that up. And then you can say, that helps you make that step, that 3-step process helps you translate from, we did this many releases and that's this much money, right? We delivered this kind of value to the company, to the business. Now, they might debate that last step, but then you can say, okay, well, maybe it's not this much revenue. Maybe my projections are off, but I worked with someone in revenue. I worked with someone in sales. I worked with someone in marketing. And you know exactly how I got from 20 releases to $5 million. I went from 20 releases to these critical features to $20 million. And then it really helps them understand and see how this functionality you're delivering helps them get there. And you're like, oh, well, if you want these features, now I can deliver them more often, 4 times a year, 5 times a year, 20 times a year, and not just once a year. Oh, you want that revenue? Oh, you want that revenue faster? I can do that for you now. And I'm working on doing that for you even better and even faster.
Perfect. Well, that really brings it full circle, right? You know, back to the beginning, focusing on, both outcomes and these global measures is really the secret here, the magic to all of this, right? So with that, why don't we, I give you the great thanks of all of us at DB Labs, Nicole, for joining us. I know your throat's been bothering you, so thank you so much for hanging in there with us. These have been great questions as well. We'll take some of that content through the recording, make those slides available, and follow up the discussion even after the event. So thank you, Nicole, and for myself and everyone at DB Labs, thank all of you for joining us today. I hope you found the webinar informational and exciting as I did, and we look forward to talking to you next time soon. Thanks so much.